Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers of the human mind, left a warning that many ignore. There are people who use you so silently that you don't even realize it until you are completely trapped. Today, we are going to reveal Jung's dark truths about hidden manipulation in relationships. Get ready, because some points will make you see people in your life in a way you may never be able to forget. The mask of the perfect friend. Persona. Carl Jung said that we are all born with a hidden face, and that to live in society we need to create a social face. The persona. It is through this mask that we show the world what it expects of us. Being polite, smiling in uncomfortable situations, giving compliments when we actually feel nothing. All of this is part of human adaptation. But Jung warned of a silent danger. Some people use this mask not as a tool for coexistence, but as a calculated weapon. How many times have you met someone who seemed too perfect to be real? That friend who always comes up with the right words, who seems to understand every detail of your life, who presents themselves as a counselor, protector, even savior. At first, it is seductive. It feels like you found a rare companion, someone you can count on in any situation. But is that perfection authentic, or is it just the surface of invisible manipulation? For Jung, the persona is inevitable. But when it is used as an absolute disguise, it becomes a trap. The perfect friend may simply be playing a role, studying your reactions, testing your limits, gaining your trust until you let your guard down. And when that happens, they already hold the keys to your emotional world. Have you ever trusted someone who seemed too generous, always willing to listen, but who, behind the curtain, was merely collecting information about you? Was that exaggerated kindness truly a virtue or a strategy? Jung believed that the persona should be flexible, a tool to make social life easier. But when a person fully identifies with this mask, they lose their true essence. And it is at this moment that falseness is born. Because those who cannot live without others' applause, those who depend on constant admiration, need to wear the mask of the impeccable friend. They need to become what you long to see. But what is the risk of being involved with someone like that? The risk is losing yourself in an unequal relationship. While you open up, believe, and share, the other merely performs. While you confess secrets, bare your soul, the other takes silent notes, waiting for the moment when everything can be used to their advantage. Now I ask you, what is worse? Being deceived by an open enemy, or by someone who presents themselves as your protector? Would you be able to tell the difference between genuine care and theatrical care? Would you have the courage to look at the people around you and ask yourself, is this kindness real, or just a carefully constructed mask to seduce me? Jung invites us to distrust excess. Excess of perfection, excess of attention, excess of support. Because where there is too much perfection, there is probably something hidden. Real life is full of flaws, silences, and contradictions. The friend who never makes mistakes, who is always available, who never shows weakness, may not be a friend at all, but an actor. And the reflection is inevitable. To what extent do you really know the people around you? To what extent is your trust being placed in a well-trained mask? And, most unsettling of all, have you yourself ever worn that mask to gain something or someone? Jung stated that facing the persona is like looking into a cruel mirror. Because admitting that the perfect friend may not exist is painful. Recognizing that you also wear masks to be accepted is even more uncomfortable. But without this confrontation, we will continue to be easy prey to rehearsed smiles and calculated words. So I leave you with this question. Have you ever suspected that someone's kindness was fake? And if you did you have the courage to remove that person's mask? Or did you prefer to go on believing in the illusion of the perfect friend? The vampire of your energy, the relationship of invisible use. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche does not live on physical nourishment alone, but also on emotional nourishment. And it is precisely for this reason that some individuals do not seek true love, sincere friendship, or real connection. They seek something else, your psychic energy. It is not your body they desire, but your vitality, your attention, your emotional strength. These people are like silent vampires who do not bite the neck but drain your soul without you realizing it. Think of someone who is always around, yet curiously, after every encounter, you feel exhausted. This person never seems satisfied. They always need your listening, your advice, your validation. They never replenish themselves. It is as if their existence is incomplete without the fuel you provide. And the inevitable question arises: is this friendship or invisible exploitation? Jung said that everything in us that is not conscious becomes destiny. And these people seem to be guided precisely by this law. Unconsciously, they approach those who have more light, more enthusiasm, more power to achieve. They see your vitality and think, here is a source I can drink from. It is not something declared, not something confessed. It is silent, yet devastating. Have you ever stopped to think how many times you felt drained in a relationship that, in theory, should have been mutually supportive? How many times did you dedicate yourself, offered your presence, gave advice, endured pain, only to realize in the end that there was never any reciprocity? Could it be that we are confusing friendship with emotional parasitism? These figures do not arrive imposing demands. They arrive as fragile, needy, eternal victims. And here is the most perverse trick: the more you give, the more you become bound. Because, deep down, you start feeling that walking away would be cruel. But isn't it even more cruel to allow someone to feed on your energy until you have nothing left for yourself? The emotional vampire, through Jung's lens, is the one who connects to your illuminated persona to draw from your unconscious shadow. They do not seek your friendship because they value who you are, but because they need what you can offer. It is as if they see in you a reservoir they can drink from whenever they feel thirsty. But who replenishes what you lose? Who cares when it is you who is in need? Now think, in how many relationships do you leave exhausted while the other leaves renewed? How many times have you felt that being with someone seemed to carry an invisible weight that wasn't yours? And the most uncomfortable question: are there people in your life who come close not because they love you, but because they desperately need what you represent? Jung warned that this dynamic is dangerous because it acts on the unconscious. The vampire of your energy rarely knows they are draining you. They truly believe they just need help. But this does not make the process any less destructive. On the contrary, it makes it even harder to notice. After all, who would have the courage to accuse a needy friend of being an energy thief? Perhaps that is why so many people remain trapped in these invisible ties. Because they fear appearing cold, cruel, selfish. But the question that echoes is, what is more selfish? Protecting your vitality or giving yourself until you become a shadow of yourself? So I leave you with this reflection. Who in your life seems to silently drain your strength? And more, how long are you willing to give energy to someone who never reciprocates? Has the time come to close the door to these invisible vampires? Or will you continue believing that constant exhaustion is merely a coincidence? The manipulator's projection. Carl Jung showed us that what we do not accept in ourselves, we project onto others. This invisible mechanism is called projection. It is as if the mind says, I cannot deal with this guilt, this shame, this fear, so I will place it onto someone else. And it is precisely here that one of the darkest tools of manipulation is born, the act of making you carry a burden that is not yours. The manipulator does not need to accuse you directly. Often, a disapproving look, a subtle phrase, a silence filled with judgment is enough. Suddenly, you feel wrong, guilty, inadequate. But stop and think, where did this weight come from? Was it yours, or was it placed on you as a borrowed burden? Imagine someone who never admits their own mistakes. Instead, they always find a way to insinuate that the fault is yours. If they fail, it's because you didn't help. If they lie, it's because you pressured them. If they distance themselves, it's because you weren't enough. projection creates a cruel theater in which you become a secondary character in a story you did not write. And what happens when we believe in this projection? We begin to live as prisoners of invented guilt. We try to compensate, please more, prove our innocence, fix what we never even did. It is an endless game, because the more we try to please, the more the manipulator projects. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. But the manipulator refuses this learning. They cannot face their own mirror. They cannot recognize their shadow. So they transfer to you everything that haunts them. Their shadow becomes your problem. Their shame becomes your pain. Their cowardice becomes your burden. Now I ask you, how many times have you felt wrong for something that, upon reflection, you realized did not originate from you? How many times have you carried the guilt for a failure you did not commit, simply because someone insisted that the responsibility was yours? The most perverse part is that projection works because it taps into our deepest insecurities. Who has never doubted themselves? Who has never asked if they truly erred, if they could have done more, if they were selfish? The manipulator knows this fragility and exploits it without mercy. They know that if they plant the seed of doubt, you yourself will water the guilt until it grows into a forest. But have you ever stopped to question whether this guilt is legitimate? Have you investigated whether this fear really arose from within you, or if it was carefully implanted to keep you submissive? Because as long as you do not question it, you remain chained. The manipulator does not need visible chains. They have learned, consciously or not, from Jung, that it is enough to place within you an emotion that does not belong to you. You become the jailer of yourself. And now I leave you with this reflection. Have you ever carried guilt that, later, you realized was not yours? If the answer is yes, perhaps you have already been a victim of this projection game. The crucial question is, will you continue allowing others to throw onto you the burdens they refuse to face? Or will you return each guilt to its rightful owner? The shadow game. Carl Jung taught us that each of us carries a hidden side within, the shadow. It is the part of the psyche that we repress, deny, or hide even from ourselves. There live fears, traumas, forbidden desires, resentments, insecurities, and impulses we consider unacceptable. The shadow is not inherently bad, but it becomes dangerous when we ignore its existence. Because as long as we remain unconscious of it, we open space for others to exploit it. Toxic, manipulative, or emotionally predatory people have an almost instinctive ability to identify these hidden shadows in others. They perceive where you are weak, where there is an open wound, where insecurity resides. And without you realizing it, they begin to play with it. Every ambiguous comment, every subtle critique, every calculated gesture of disapproval is aimed at your shadow, precisely to awaken guilt, doubt, or fear. The shadow functions as an invisible yet vulnerable territory. When you ignore your dark side, when you pretend it does not exist, you allow others to walk over it. They do not need to attack your light directly. It is enough to manipulate your shadows to gain power over you. And the perverse part is that, most of the time, you do not even realize you are being influenced. You only feel the emotional weight, the anxiety, the constant doubt, without understanding that all of this was triggered by someone who knows your blind spots. Jung asserted that confronting the shadow is one of the most important steps on the path to self-knowledge. When you acknowledge your own fragilities, fears, and traumas, they lose their power over you. But as long as you deny them, the shadow becomes a weapon in the hands of those who seek to control or manipulate. It is as if you had a secret territory and left the door open for strangers to enter and take possession of it. How many times have you felt vulnerable in front of someone and could not understand why? How many times has a word, a gesture, or a silence from another person triggered feelings of fear, anger, or shame, and you did not even know where they came from? This is the shadow game in action, your inner fragility being exploited as a tool of power. The shadow is not just weakness, it is also a mirror of what has not yet been integrated into your consciousness. Every blind spot you carry is an entry point for manipulation. That is why Jung invited us to look deeply within ourselves, to courageously investigate what we do not like to admit, to face our fears without escape. Now think, what is your most neglected shadow? Which trait that you avoid confronting gives power to others over you? How many times have you noticed that you react intensely to someone but do not understand why? What is being triggered is not the other person's fault, but the shadow you have yet to recognize. The great paradox, according to Jung, is that the same shadow that can be exploited can also be transformed. By bringing your weaknesses into the light, you turn vulnerability into strength. Awareness of the shadow destroys the power others try to exert over you. The game stops being theirs and becomes yours, because now you know the rules, understand the board, and can play strategically. So reflect, what is the weakness that makes you most vulnerable? And above all, are you ready to face it head-on and reclaim the power that others have tried to take from you by exploiting what you have worked so hard to hide? The silence that manipulates. Carl Jung taught us that communication is not limited to words. Silence also carries meaning, intensity, and power. And it is precisely in this empty space that many manipulative people find their most subtle and cruel weapon. Calculated silence is not the absence of expression. It is a strategic way to exert control over you, to awaken doubt, fear, or guilt without raising their voice or confronting you directly. Think of someone who suddenly stops responding to your messages, ignores your attempts to reach out, or maintains a distant attitude without explanation. At first, you try to rationalize. Is this person busy, tired, distracted? But as the silence stretches on, the emotional weight increases. Each moment of waiting becomes tension, each lack of response echoes as judgment, and you begin to doubt yourself. Jung warned that it is at this point that the mind becomes a prisoner of the manipulator. You feel guilt and anxiety, but cannot locate the source. Silence, when used as a tool of manipulation, is not passive. It is an active presence, a non-verbal message that screams louder than any argument. It creates an emotional void that forces you to search for explanations, justify your actions, and try to fix something that may not even exist. It is the perfect control, invisible, almost imperceptible, yet incredibly effective. How many times have you found yourself trapped in such a situation? A friend, partner, or colleague who suddenly withdraws, avoids dialogue, turning absence into a form of silent punishment. You feel that something is wrong, but you do not know exactly what. And the effect is devastating. While the manipulator remains calm, you carry the weight of tension, the fear of having done wrong, the desperate need to correct a situation that may not even exist. Jung reminded us that silence can hurt more than words because it touches the psyche directly, hitting insecurity, doubt, and the need for connection. It creates a space where you feel alone, exposed, and vulnerable, often leading you to take on responsibilities that are not yours. Silence acts as a shadow over your thoughts, manipulating without direct confrontation. The most perverse part is that manipulative silence is hard to identify because it seems natural. We all experience moments of withdrawal or introspection, but the manipulator turns these moments into strategy. Every pause, every lack of response, every distant look is calculated to create psychological effect. And the more you try to fill the void with explanations, the more you become entangled in it. Now reflect. Have you ever felt that someone's silence hurt you more than criticism, accusation, or insult? Have you ever wondered if it was you punishing yourself emotionally by trying to decipher what did not need decoding? Jung teaches us that recognizing the power of silence is the first step to reclaiming control. Understanding that the void imposed by another person does not define your guilt or responsibility is liberating. The inevitable question remains: do you believe that silence can hurt more than words? And if so, have you noticed when someone uses this silent weapon against you to exercise control, manipulation, or invisible dominance over your mind and emotions? The invisible contract, relationships of hidden interests. Carl Jung warned us about something many people ignore: A large part of human relationships is governed by invisible contracts, silent agreements that determine who gives, who receives, and what is expected in return. These contracts are rarely formalized or spoken. They exist in the unconscious, guiding interactions in imperceptible ways. Essentially, you give something, attention, support, affection, time, or effort, and expect something back. But the problem arises when the exchange becomes unequal, when you invest without realizing that the other person has no intention of reciprocating. Imagine a friendship, a romantic relationship, or even a professional partnership in which you constantly strive to please, help, and support. You give of yourself, become emotionally involved, share experiences, reveal secrets and vulnerabilities. But little by little, you realize that the other person never offers the same. There is no reciprocity, no recognition, no effort to balance the relationship. Jung described this dynamic as a violated invisible contract, a silent expectation that leaves the soul exhausted. The most subtle and painful part is that you do not notice it immediately. The invisible contract operates at an unconscious level. At first, everything seems natural. You believe you are helping someone out of love or friendship. But the more you give, the stronger the feeling of imbalance becomes. You start questioning yourself. Am I overdoing it? Am I being selfish for wanting reciprocity? Jung warns that this mental confusion is precisely what makes exploitation so effective. How many times have you found yourself reflecting on the amount of energy, time, or attention you give in a relationship without receiving anything in return? How many times have you felt trapped, suffocated, or exhausted, yet hesitated to leave the situation for fear of seeming insensitive, selfish, or cruel? This is the weight of the invisible contract. It turns generosity into imprisonment and goodwill into an emotional trap. The manipulator, consciously or unconsciously, controls this contract. They know your expectations, your desire for connection, and your need for belonging. They allow you to commit emotionally, to give of yourself, while they maintain a passive, silent, or calculatedly indifferent stance. The inequality becomes obvious, yet you still feel guilty for noticing. After all, it is difficult to confront someone when the relationship seems invisible and, at the same time, so necessary. Jung invites us to observe these relationships with attention and honesty. He reminds us that every human interaction is a two-way street, and when balance is systematically violated, it is time to rethink the silent contract that governs your life. Recognizing that you are investing in a relationship of unequal exchange is not selfishness, it is awareness. It is acknowledging that your energy, your time, and your attention have value and cannot be exploited without return. Now reflect. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a relationship of unequal exchange? How many times have you given your best, believing in reciprocity, only to realize you were dealing with someone who never intended to give back? Jung teaches us that the first step toward liberation is seeing the invisible contract. Because as long as you do not identify the relationship as unbalanced, you will continue playing the role of giver without ever receiving in return. The fascination of the narcissist. Carl Jung introduced us to the concept of archetypes, universal figures that inhabit the collective unconscious and shape human behavior. Among these figures, there is one that captivates and fascinates at first sight: the narcissist. They do not appear overtly, with hostility or open aggression. On the contrary, their appearance is seductive, charismatic, and magnetic. Jung warned us that the initial fascination is part of the trap, a way to attract, engage, and emotionally ensnare their victims before the destructive side is revealed. The narcissist has an almost instinctive talent for presenting themselves as extraordinary. They speak with confidence, display intelligence, charisma, and apparent empathy. They are capable of making you feel special, unique, and understood in a way that seems impossible to experience with others. But Jung reminds us that this seduction is strategic. It creates emotional dependence, strengthens trust, and opens doors for manipulation to begin. The danger of the narcissist lies in their thirst for power and control. After winning your fascination, They begin to exploit your vulnerabilities, fears, and insecurities. They redirect the focus of the relationship onto themselves, demand constant attention and validation without offering genuine reciprocity. That initial sparkle transforms into emotional pressure, disguised criticism, and subtle manipulations that erode your self-esteem and mental balance. How many times have you met someone who seemed perfect, capable of understanding and supporting unconditionally, only to later reveal selfish, destructive, or controlling behaviors? Jung explains that this transformation is not accidental. The narcissist follows archetypal patterns that allow them to captivate, dominate, and use others as reflections of their own need for power. They feed off admiration from others and the sense of importance they manage to evoke. The fascinating and terrifying aspect is that the relationship often persists even after warning signs appear. The initial seduction created a deep emotional bond, and you question whether you are overreacting, being too sensitive, or if the fault is yours. Jung said that the collective unconscious teaches humanity to connect with powerful figures, which is precisely why many people repeatedly fall into narcissistic relationships. They are drawn to that apparent light, ignoring the shadow hidden behind it. And here comes the inevitable reflection. To what extent does the narcissist's fascination prevent us from seeing the truth? How often do we allow ourselves to be blinded by charisma and eloquence, only to later suffer the consequences of manipulation and selfishness? Jung invites us to question these figures and, more importantly, to look inward. What in us makes us vulnerable to this seduction? So think, have you ever met someone who seemed brilliant but turned out to be an emotional disaster? And if so, how many times did you ignore the initial signs, allowing the seduction to turn into pain? Jung teaches us that recognizing the narcissistic pattern is the first step in protecting our energy, autonomy, and emotional well-being before it is too late. The friend who wants to be the owner. Carl Jung warned that not every relationship that appears as friendship is truly based on genuine affection. Some people approach with the appearance of care, support, and companionship, but hide a very different intention: control and possession. From a Jungian perspective, these friends cannot tolerate your autonomy. They see your independence, your choices, and your freedom as threats that must be neutralized, often in subtle and disguised ways. The friend who wants to be the owner acts as if they are offering advice and protection, but in reality, they are establishing invisible boundaries for your behavior. They determine, without your awareness, what is acceptable or not, trying to shape your decisions, habits, and even opinions to fit the vision they have of you. Jung teaches us that this attitude is not friendship, it is emotional possession. How many times have you felt suffocated in an apparently close relationship without fully understanding why? How often did that ever-present friend always seem to have the right answer, always know what is best for you, while their suggestions came loaded with judgment or implicit expectations? This is the dynamic Jung would call persona manipulation. While you strive to please, the other strengthens themselves, keeping your autonomy limited within the relationship. The danger of this relationship is silent. Unlike open aggression or explicit conflict, the controlling friend hides behind words of encouragement, concerned advice, and seemingly loving behaviors. They build a pattern in which you begin to doubt your own decisions, measure every step you take, and question your choices. And the more you yield, the more they feel entitled to set the boundaries of your life. Jung would remind us that independence is one of the pillars of psychic balance. When we allow someone to try to shape us or bind us to the expectations of others, we give up part of our authenticity. Our persona, that social mask we use to interact, becomes controlled by someone else, no longer by ourselves. It is an invisible path to emotional submission, disguised as care. So ask yourself, how many times have you accepted opinions, criticism, or limits imposed by someone who claimed to be a friend, but in reality only wanted to exercise control? How often did you feel the need to explain or justify your decisions, even knowing they were legitimate, to avoid disapproval or dissatisfaction? Jung's warning is clear. True friendships respect boundaries, promote growth, and encourage autonomy. The friend who wants to be the owner does the opposite. They turn trust into surveillance, support into pressure, and care into manipulation. And it is in this contrast that the difference between genuine friendship and emotional possession is revealed. Now reflect. Have you ever felt that someone wanted to control you under the guise of care? And if so, to what extent did you allow that influence to shape your choices and your freedom before realizing it was not friendship, but possession? The collective unconscious and social masks. Carl Jung introduced us to the concept of the collective unconscious, a layer of the human psyche shared by all humanity, containing universal patterns, images, and experiences that influence our behaviors, attitudes, and relationships without our awareness. According to Jung, much of what we repeat in society is not a conscious choice but a reflection of these ancestral patterns we carry. Among them, patterns of manipulation, hierarchy, and emotional control often manifest, guiding social interactions almost automatically. When we think of social masks, Jung explains that it is not just about individuality. The persona each of us wears to adapt to the world is deeply connected to what society expects. And the most subtle and dangerous aspect is that these masks are not only individual, they are collective. Society teaches us, often unconsciously, to smile when we don't feel joy, to compliment out of convenience, to avoid confrontations, and most importantly, to manipulate situations to secure our acceptance or survival within groups. The result is a silent cycle of manipulation that perpetuates itself. People reproduce patterns learned early on, often without awareness. They mimic behaviors they observed in family, school, or work, believing that acting this way is natural or necessary. Jung would warn us that much of the emotional aggression, competition disguised as friendship, or exploitation of others' vulnerabilities does not stem from deliberate malice but from the unconscious repetition of internalized social patterns. How many times have you noticed manipulative behaviors in people who seem to act naturally, as if there were no intent? How often has society shaped someone to act strategically, to control, measure, or exploit situations for their own benefit, without them ever questioning this practice? These behaviors are reinforced by the collective unconscious, invisible rules that everyone learns but that are rarely discussed consciously. The most unsettling part is that while each individual believes they are acting with freedom and autonomy, much of their behavior follows guidelines stemming from something greater and invisible. The need for social acceptance, survival within groups, and the maintenance of status or prestige. Jung shows us that social manipulation is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a reflection of deeply rooted collective patterns that manifest daily in our interactions. Therefore, when we encounter people who manipulate subtly, it is often more a reflection of social conditioning than of conscious malice. But that does not make it any less painful or impactful. Jung's lesson here is clear. Until we recognize these collective patterns and our own social masks, we will remain subject to the influence of behaviors that confuse, drain, and manipulate us, often without us even realizing it. Now reflect. Do you believe society teaches people to manipulate? And if so, to what extent have you yourself reproduced patterns of control and manipulation without noticing, simply because they are part of the invisible rules we have followed since childhood? Jung challenges us to look at these structures and consciously decide how we want to act within them. When love is just control. Carl Jung warned us about a dangerous and often invisible phenomenon in human relationships: love disguised as control. Many people believe that love is expressed solely through care, protection, and concern for the other. But Jung teaches us that not all care is genuine. Some people use the discourse of love as a justification to exert dominance, manipulate decisions, and keep you within boundaries that serve only themselves. This type of relationship is treacherous because it mixes affection with oppression. The classic phrase, "it's for your own good," can become an emotional trap. When you hear these words, you feel a sense of security, but at the same time, you begin to lose freedom. Every decision, every personal choice, every step you take becomes questioned or directed by the other. Jung explains that, in this context, what presents itself as love is, in fact, a form of covert control, a subtle method of maintaining power over you without the need for confrontation or overt aggression. The psychological effect is devastating. The person under control begins to doubt themselves. Their desires, opinions, and feelings are constantly evaluated, interpreted, and often devalued. It is common for the victim to internalize the idea that they need to be molded, corrected, or limited in order to deserve the love of the other. Jung would call this unconscious manipulation of the persona and the shadow. While you try to please to maintain the bond, the controller grows stronger emotionally. How many times have you found yourself giving in to a relationship because you believed the other person was right, even knowing deep down that your choices were valid? How often have you confused excessive care with genuine interest, affection with obligation, or guidance with submission? Jung reminds us that true love does not suppress, limit, or subjugate. It respects autonomy, values the freedom of choice, and allows each individual to flourish without fear of judgment or emotional retaliation. The paradox is that, often, those who practice control disguised as love genuinely believe they are acting correctly. They do not see that their own need to dominate is an expression of fear or insecurity, projected as care. But for the one being controlled, the impact is real. Emotional exhaustion, a sense of imprisonment, and confusion about what is truly affection and what is manipulation. Now reflect. To what extent have you confused love with control? How many times have you accepted limits and restrictions under the pretense of concern or care, only to later realize that you were being emotionally manipulated? Jung teaches us that recognizing this difference is essential to preserve one's own energy, self-esteem, and emotional freedom. So think deeply. Have you ever mistaken love for control? And if so, do you still maintain relationships where care is mixed with dominance, without realizing that what should be genuine affection is being used as a tool of power? The danger of denying reality. Carl Jung warned that one of the greatest traps of the human mind is denial. Denying facts, behaviors, or feelings does not make them disappear. On the contrary, it creates fertile ground for pain, confusion, and manipulation. When we close our eyes to reality, we allow external forces to take control, often in subtle and silent ways. The manipulator thrives precisely in this void. They grow where you pretend not to see, prosper in what you refuse to face. Denying reality is an act of self-protection that, paradoxically, makes us vulnerable. Jung described denial as seeing and not wanting to see. You notice warning signs, toxic behaviors, clear manipulations, but choose to ignore them to avoid conflict, discomfort, or loss. This choice creates a constant internal tension. The mind knows something is wrong, but emotion and fear speak louder, preventing consciousness from taking action. Imagine a situation where you sense that a friendship, romantic relationship, or even a family bond is imbalanced. Subtle signs appear: emotional manipulation, control disguised as care, exploitation of vulnerabilities. Yet, out of fear of losing the person or breaking the bond, you decide not to see, not to confront, not to react. Jung explains that each act of denial is a step toward emotional enslavement. The manipulator senses this hesitation, notices your doubt, and uses it to consolidate their power. How many times have you pretended everything was fine, even while feeling discomfort, anger, or injustice? How often have you chosen to remain silent or ignore clear signs of manipulation to avoid confrontation, or because you believed losing the relationship would be worse than facing the truth? Jung reminds us that denial does not protect, it imprisons. By ignoring what is before your eyes, you make space for others to define your reality, impose invisible rules, and control your emotional energy. The danger is silent but profound. With each act of denial, you internalize the idea that what you see or feel doesn't matter, that your perception is flawed. And while you submit to this self-erasure, the manipulator grows, strengthens, and shapes the relationship according to their interests, without resistance. Jung believed that facing reality, no matter how painful, is a fundamental step toward reclaiming autonomy, clarity, and personal power. The first move is to recognize that ignoring the truth solves nothing. Pretending not to notice does not turn unjust situations into neutral experiences. Conscious awareness, even when uncomfortable, is the only weapon against invisible manipulation. So reflect. Have you ever pretended not to see something just to avoid losing a relationship? And if so, how much did that silence allow others to take control of your emotional life, taking advantage of your denial to keep their power intact? Jung teaches us that facing reality, no matter how difficult, is the path to reclaiming freedom and protecting our soul from manipulators and falsehoods. Liberation through consciousness. Carl Jung left us a powerful lesson. True emotional and psychological freedom only arises when we bring to light what was hidden. Every repressed shadow, every denied insecurity, every manipulation we ignore holds power over us until consciousness acknowledges it. Jung stated, "What we deny controls us. What we accept frees us." This is precisely why self-knowledge is the key to breaking any cycle of manipulation. The journey to liberation begins by looking within. Recognizing your own shadow, accepting your vulnerabilities, and understanding how your persona presents itself to the world is the first step. When you identify patterns of manipulative behavior, both in others and yourself, you stop being an unconscious victim and begin to act with clarity. Manipulation only works when there is blindness, doubt, or denial. By bringing awareness to these elements, you regain control of your emotional energy and personal space. Imagine a relationship where someone constantly seeks to drain your energy, exert control, or impose guilt. Before, you might have felt trapped, exhausted, and confused, questioning your own perceptions. But when consciousness awakens, everything changes. You begin to notice warning signs, understand hidden intentions, and make conscious decisions. Jung teaches that mental and emotional clarity is an invisible armor. No one can use what you recognize, understand, and manage with awareness. The process is neither instant nor easy. Facing your shadow can generate discomfort, anxiety, or fear. Recognizing manipulations requires courage to accept that some relationships are unbalanced or harmful. But it is precisely this courage that transforms pain into power, suffering into learning, and confusion into clarity. The more you know yourself, the lighter the presence of others around you becomes, because they no longer find fertile ground to exercise control. Jung reminds us that self-knowledge is not just an individual practice. It is a strategy for emotional survival. Those who understand their own limitations, desires, and blind spots know where and when to set boundaries. Those who recognize their shadow do not allow it to be exploited by others. Those who understand their persona can distinguish between genuine acceptance and disguised manipulation. This is the path to liberation, to see clearly, feel truthfully, and act consciously. Now reflect deeply. Do you believe that self-knowledge is the only weapon against those who try to manipulate you? Who in your life might be using you without your awareness? Jung challenges us not only to look outward but also inward. Freedom begins when the light of consciousness illuminates the darkest corners of the mind and heart. So here is the final provocation. Who do you allow to control your energy, your attention, or your choices without realizing it? Share your thoughts in the comments. This could be the first step toward your true liberation. Recognizing manipulation is difficult, but accepting that you can break free is transformative. Jung shows us that consciousness is the only key capable of breaking invisible chains and returning power over our own lives.